17 years ago, Jessica Miller disappeared into the wilderness of the Adirondack Mountains, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a family shattered by grief. The 34-year-old marketing executive from Albany had told her husband David she needed time alone to clear her mind after months of mounting work pressure and personal struggles that had begun to consume their marriage. Before we continue, subscribe, like this video, and ring the notification bell. This helps the channel bring you more stories like this one. On that cold November morning in 2008, Jessica packed her Jeep Cherokee with enough supplies for what she described as a spiritual retreat, a week of solitude in a remote cabin she had rented through an obscure listing she found online. The cabin, tucked deep in the forest near the Canadian border, promised complete isolation from the modern world. No cell service, no internet, just the silence she desperately sought. David Miller still remembers their final conversation with painful clarity. Standing in their kitchen, Jessica had seemed different, distant, almost ethereal, as if she was already somewhere else entirely. "I need to find myself again," she had whispered, kissing him goodbye with tears in her eyes. "Take care of Emma while I'm gone." Their 7-year-old daughter was still sleeping upstairs, unaware that this would be the last time she would see her mother. The cabin Jessica had rented belonged to an elderly man named Thomas Hartwell, a reclusive figure who had inherited the property from his grandfather decades earlier. The listing was sparse, just a few grainy photos of a rustic one-room structure with a stone fireplace and basic amenities. What attracted Jessica was the promise of complete solitude, miles away from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense pine forests. Jessica's plan was simple: spend 7 days writing in her journal, hiking the surrounding trails, and reconnecting with the person she felt she had lost in the chaos of modern life. She had been struggling with what she called existential emptiness, a deep sadness that had settled over her like a fog after years of climbing the corporate ladder while watching her daughter grow up in brief moments between business meetings. The first 3 days passed without incident. Jessica had called David twice using the cabin's old landline, her voice sounding more relaxed each time. She described watching deer graze outside her window at dawn, the therapeutic crackle of the fireplace, and the profound peace that came with each passing hour of silence. "I think I'm starting to remember who I am," she had told him during their last conversation. But on the 4th day, the call stopped. David initially wasn't concerned. Jessica had mentioned wanting to disconnect completely, and he assumed she had decided to embrace the isolation more fully. But when she failed to return home on the agreed date, his worry transformed into panic. He drove the 3 hours to the Adirondacks, following the GPS coordinates Jessica had left him, his heart pounding as each mile brought him deeper into the wilderness. What he found at the cabin would haunt him forever. Jessica's Jeep was parked outside, her belongings still inside, but there was no sign of her anywhere. The cabin door was unlocked. Her journal lay open on the small wooden table with her final entry dated 4 days earlier, and her coffee cup sat on the kitchen counter, still containing the remnants of what appeared to be her last meal. The local sheriff's department launched an immediate search operation, deploying K9 units, helicopters, and dozens of volunteers who combed through miles of dense forest. They found nothing, no footprints leading away from the cabin, no signs of struggle, no trace of Jessica Miller anywhere in the vast wilderness that seemed to have swallowed her whole. Thomas Hartwell, the cabin's owner, was questioned extensively, but provided little useful information. He claimed he barely knew Jessica, had never met her in person, and had only communicated with her through email regarding the rental. His alibi was solid. He had been visiting his sister in Florida during the entire period of Jessica's disappearance. As days turned to weeks and weeks to months, the search efforts gradually diminished. The case was eventually classified as a missing person investigation with no clear leads, and Jessica Miller became another name in the growing file of unsolved disappearances that plague America's vast wilderness areas each year. But for David Miller and young Emma, the nightmare was just beginning. The disappearance destroyed their family in ways that extended far beyond Jessica's absence. David struggled to maintain his job as a high school teacher while caring for Emma, who spent months crying herself to sleep, asking when Mommy was coming home. Friends and extended family offered support, but nothing could fill the void left by Jessica's mysterious vanishing. Years passed, and the case grew cold, filed away in a dusty cabinet at the local sheriff's office alongside dozens of other unsolved mysteries. The Miller family never recovered from Jessica's disappearance. What began as desperate hope slowly transformed into a chronic wound that refused to heal, affecting every aspect of their remaining lives in ways both subtle and profound. David Miller aged decades in the months following his wife's vanishing. The vibrant high school history teacher, who had once captivated students with passionate lectures about social justice, became a hollow shell of his former self. Colleagues watched helplessly as he struggled to maintain basic classroom functions, often staring out windows during lessons as if expecting Jessica to appear walking across the school parking lot. Emma, who had been only 7 when her mother disappeared, grew up constructing elaborate fantasies about Jessica's return. For years, she insisted on setting a place at the dinner table for her mother, believing with childlike faith that Jessica had simply gotten lost in the woods and would eventually find her way home. As she entered her teenage years, these fantasies evolved into something darker, a deep-seated belief that her mother had abandoned them intentionally, choosing the wilderness over her family. The official investigation had been thorough, but ultimately fruitless. Detective Sarah Chen, who had led the initial search efforts, spent countless hours interviewing everyone who had any connection to Jessica's final days. She examined Jessica's phone records, bank statements, and email correspondence, searching for any clue that might explain the disappearance. Every lead resulted in dead ends. The cabin where Jessica had stayed was processed multiple times by forensic teams. They found her fingerprints throughout the small space, confirming she had been there, but discovered no evidence of foul play. Her personal belongings remained undisturbed, clothes neatly folded in her suitcase, toiletries arranged on the bathroom counter, even her expensive camera sitting on the nightstand with dozens of photos of the surrounding forest. Detective Chen had been particularly intrigued by Jessica's journal, which contained increasingly introspective entries during her first 3 days at the cabin. The writing revealed a woman grappling with profound existential questions, someone who felt disconnected from her own life despite having achieved conventional success. The final entry, written on her 4th day, was uncharacteristically brief. "I finally understand what I need to do. The answers have been here all along." Thomas Hartwell, the elderly cabin owner, became a person of interest despite his solid alibi. Detective Chen found his behavior during questioning oddly detached, as if Jessica's disappearance was merely an inconvenience rather than a human tragedy. He claimed to rarely visit the remote property, using it primarily as a hunting retreat that he visited only a few times each year. As the case aged, new theories emerged and were systematically dismissed. Some speculated that Jessica had suffered a mental breakdown and wandered into the wilderness, succumbing to exposure in the harsh November weather. Others suggested she had been attacked by wildlife, though no evidence supported this theory. The most persistent rumor was that Jessica had staged her own disappearance, starting a new life somewhere far away, though her failure to access bank accounts or contact her family made this scenario unlikely. David hired private investigators, spending his savings on professionals who promised fresh perspectives on the case. Each investigation yielded the same result. Jessica Miller had simply vanished without a trace, as if she had never existed at all. The financial strain of these failed attempts further complicated the family's grief, forcing David to take a second job to make ends meet. Emma's relationship with her father deteriorated as she blamed him for Jessica's disappearance. In her teenage mind, if David had been a better husband, her mother wouldn't have needed to escape to the mountains. She began acting out in school, failing classes, and experimenting with dangerous behaviors that landed her in the principal's office regularly. The community that had initially rallied around the Miller family gradually moved on to other tragedies and concerns. Jessica's disappearance became old news, mentioned only occasionally when someone spotted a missing person poster that had somehow survived weather and time. The annual search efforts organized by volunteers dwindled until they stopped altogether. Detective Chen, who had been promoted and transferred to other cases, never forgot Jessica Miller. Even years later, she would occasionally revisit the file, hoping that advances in technology or new information might provide the breakthrough that had eluded the original investigation. She kept Jessica's photograph on her desk as a reminder of the cases that haunt law enforcement officers, the ones that never get resolved. By 2020, 12 years after Jessica's disappearance, the case had been effectively abandoned. The original evidence was stored in the department's cold case facility, and the younger officers had never heard of Jessica Miller. Her name appeared in databases and missing person websites, but the active investigation had long since ended. David Miller, now in his 50s, had learned to live with the uncertainty, though it continued to shape every aspect of his existence. He never remarried, never removed Jessica's belongings from their bedroom, and never stopped hoping that someday, somehow, he would learn what happened to the woman he had loved since college. Emma, now a young adult, had developed her own coping mechanisms that involved avoiding any discussion of her mother. She had moved across the country for college, putting physical distance between herself and the memories that haunted their hometown. None of them could have imagined that the answer to Jessica's disappearance was waiting patiently in the very place she had vanished, hidden in plain sight for 17 years. November 15th, 2025, began like any other hunting season morning for Marcus Thompson, a retired park ranger who had spent decades exploring the Adirondack wilderness. The 58-year-old outdoorsman had purchased a high-end drone the previous year, planning to use it for scouting deer patterns in the remote areas where he preferred to hunt alone. Thompson had always been drawn to the deepest, most isolated sections of the forest, places where human presence was measured in decades rather than days. On this particular morning, he was investigating an area near the Canadian border that he had marked on his GPS during a summer hiking expedition. The region was accessible only by an old logging road that had been abandoned for more than 20 years. The weather was perfect for his purposes: clear skies, minimal wind, and the kind of crisp November air that made the forest feel both alive and eternal. Thompson launched his drone from a small clearing, programming it to conduct a systematic aerial survey of the surrounding area. His goal was to identify game trails and water sources that would be invisible from ground level. As the drone climbed above the tree line, Thompson's attention was initially focused on the technical aspects of the flight. He was still relatively new to drone operation and wanted to ensure he maintained proper altitude and battery levels throughout the survey. The high-definition camera captured sweeping views of the wilderness, revealing the intricate patterns of deer paths and the locations of small streams that wound through the dense forest. It was during the third pass over a particularly remote area that Thompson noticed something unusual in his monitor. Tucked into a small valley, almost completely hidden by towering pines, sat a tiny cabin that didn't appear on any of his maps. The structure looked abandoned, with weathered wood siding and what appeared to be a damaged roof. Curiosity compelled Thompson to maneuver the drone closer to the mysterious cabin. As the aircraft descended, the camera revealed more details about the isolated structure. A vehicle was parked outside, an SUV that looked like it had been sitting in the same spot for years. Vegetation had begun to grow around the tires, and the once dark paint had faded to a dull grey. Thompson's decades of experience in search and rescue operations had taught him to recognize signs of abandoned campsites and forgotten hunting cabins. The Adirondacks were scattered with such places, structures that had been left behind when their owners died or lost interest in maintaining remote properties. Usually, these discoveries were merely curiosities, interesting footnotes to his wilderness explorations. But something about this particular cabin felt different. The drone's camera revealed details that made Thompson increasingly uncomfortable. The cabin's front door was standing open, hanging slightly askew on its hinges, as if it had been that way for years. Through the opening, he could see overturned furniture and debris scattered across the floor. Most disturbing was what appeared to be personal belongings still inside, items that suggested someone had left suddenly and never returned. Thompson decided to investigate the cabin's exterior more thoroughly, piloting the drone in a slow circle around the structure. It was during this survey that he noticed the chimney, a tall stone structure that rose from the cabin's roof like a finger pointing accusingly at the sky. The top of the chimney appeared to be partially blocked, which wasn't unusual for an abandoned building. Animals often built nests in unused chimneys, and debris could accumulate over time. But as Thompson adjusted the camera angle and increased the resolution, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Wedged inside the chimney, visible only from directly above, was what appeared to be fabric, clothing that had once been brightly colored but had faded after years of exposure to the elements. The fabric was tangled around what looked like bone, creating a horrific composition that could mean only one thing. Thompson immediately landed the drone and called 911, his hands shaking as he provided GPS coordinates to the dispatcher. Within hours, the remote cabin was surrounded by law enforcement vehicles, crime scene investigators, and the same search and rescue teams that had scoured these woods 17 years earlier looking for Jessica Miller. Detective Sarah Chen, now a captain but still haunted by unsolved cases, was among the first to arrive at the scene. The moment she saw the cabin, she knew they had found the answer to one of the most frustrating mysteries of her career. The vehicle registration confirmed what she already suspected. The SUV belonged to Jessica Miller. The recovery operation was delicate and heartbreaking. Fire department personnel used specialized equipment to carefully extract what remained from the chimney, a process that took several hours and revealed the full extent of the tragedy that had occurred in this isolated place. Jessica Miller had been found, but the circumstances of her discovery raised more questions than they answered. How had she ended up in the chimney? Why hadn't previous searches located the cabin? And most troubling of all, what had happened during those final days that led to such a bizarre and tragic end? The cabin's interior told a story of desperation and terror. Jessica's journal, recovered from the debris, contained additional entries that had not been present during the original investigation. The final pages revealed a woman who had discovered something horrifying about the man who owned the cabin, something that had transformed her peaceful retreat into a nightmare. Thompson's drone footage became crucial evidence in what would soon become a reopened homicide investigation. The retired park ranger had inadvertently solved one of the region's most enduring mysteries, but the solution would prove to be just the beginning of an even more disturbing story. As news of the discovery spread, David Miller received the phone call he had both hoped for and dreaded for 17 years. His wife had been found, but the circumstances of her death suggested that Jessica's final days had been far from the peaceful solitude she had sought in the mountains. The recovery of Jessica Miller's remains triggered the largest criminal investigation the Adirondack region had seen in decades. Captain Sarah Chen, who had never forgotten the case that launched her career, found herself once again walking through the remote cabin where Jessica had spent her final days, but this time with the grim knowledge of how the story ended. The cabin's interior revealed a timeline of terror that contradicted everything investigators had believed about Jessica's disappearance. Personal belongings that should have been covered in 17 years of dust appeared to have been disturbed recently. More disturbing was the discovery of additional pages in Jessica's journal, entries that had been hidden or removed during the original investigation. These newly discovered writings painted a horrifying picture of Jessica's final week. The early entries matched those found in 2008, describing her peaceful first days at the cabin and her growing sense of inner calm. But the later pages, written in increasingly frantic handwriting, revealed that Jessica had not been alone in the wilderness, as she had believed. "Someone has been watching the cabin," read one entry dated 3 days after her arrival. "I thought I saw a figure in the tree line this morning, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. I'm probably just being paranoid. The isolation is getting to me more than I expected." The entries became progressively more disturbing. Jessica wrote about hearing footsteps on the cabin's roof at night, about finding her belongings moved when she returned from daily walks, and about the growing certainty that someone was stalking her in the remote wilderness. Most chilling was her final entry. "Thomas knows I figured it out. I found the other journals hidden under the floorboards. I know what happened to the others. I have to get out of here, but the car won't start. He's been planning this." Captain Chen immediately ordered a thorough search of the cabin's interior, focusing on the area Jessica had mentioned in her journal. Beneath loose floorboards in the cabin's main room, investigators discovered a collection of personal items that would transform the case from a mysterious disappearance into a serial murder investigation. Hidden in the space were 3 other journals, each belonging to different women who had rented the cabin during previous years. The entries followed similar patterns, initial descriptions of peaceful retreats that gradually transformed into accounts of stalking, harassment, and growing terror. Each journal ended abruptly, with no explanation of what had happened to their authors. The discovery prompted an immediate investigation into the cabin's rental history. Thomas Hartwell had been advertising the property through various online platforms for more than a decade, specifically targeting single women seeking isolated retreats. His listings emphasized the cabin's remote location and complete privacy, attracting vulnerable individuals who were dealing with personal crises or seeking escape from stressful lives. A search of missing person databases revealed a disturbing pattern. Over the past 15 years, at least 6 women had disappeared while traveling to remote areas of the Adirondacks. All had been found to have made reservations at cabins owned by Hartwell or his associates. All had vanished without a trace, their cases eventually filed as unsolved disappearances. Thomas Hartwell, now 73 years old, had been living quietly in a retirement community in Florida, maintaining the facade of a harmless elderly man who occasionally rented out his inherited property. When police arrived to question him, they found an individual who showed no surprise at their presence, as if he had been expecting this moment for years. During interrogation, Hartwell's demeanor was unnaturally calm. He answered questions with the detached precision of someone discussing mundane business matters, rather than multiple murders. When confronted with evidence found in the cabin, he showed no emotion, no surprise, no denial, only the quiet satisfaction of someone whose secret had finally been revealed. "I gave them what they were looking for," Hartwell told investigators during one of his recorded interviews. "They all came to the mountains seeking peace, seeking escape from their problems. I helped them find permanent peace. They should be grateful." The investigation revealed that Hartwell had been operating his deadly scheme for more than a decade and a half. He would identify vulnerable women through their online posts and rental inquiries, then carefully groom them as potential victims. Once they arrived at his remote cabin, he would begin a campaign of psychological terrorism designed to trap them in the wilderness. Hartwell had disabled Jessica's vehicle on her 4th day, then spent the following weeks playing a cat-and-mouse game that involved stalking her through the forest, preventing her from leaving, and gradually driving her to desperation. The other journals suggested he had perfected this technique through practice on previous victims. The forensic analysis of Jessica's remains revealed that she had died from smoke inhalation, trapped in the chimney where she had apparently tried to hide from Hartwell. The narrow space had become her tomb when Hartwell lit a fire in the fireplace below, either intentionally or as part of his psychological torture. She had spent her final hours in the most claustrophobic circumstances imaginable, breathing smoke and fumes as her oxygen supply slowly diminished. David Miller, who had spent 17 years wondering what happened to his wife, was finally given the answers he had desperately sought. But the truth was more horrifying than any scenario he had imagined during the long years of uncertainty. Jessica had not died quickly in an accident or animal attack. She had spent days being terrorized by a predator who had deliberately targeted her vulnerability. The discovery of Jessica's fate and the evidence of multiple murders created a media sensation that reached far beyond the Adirondacks. Thomas Hartwell became the face of a new type of serial killer, one who used modern technology and the anonymity of vacation rental platforms to identify and isolate victims in remote locations. Emma Miller, now 24 years old, learned about her mother's fate through a phone call from her father. The young woman who had spent her childhood believing her mother had abandoned the family now understood that Jessica had died fighting for her life, trying desperately to return home. The arrest of Thomas Hartwell opened a Pandora's box that revealed the true scope of his crimes and the systematic way he had used technology to hunt human prey. FBI analysts working with local investigators began tracing Hartwell's digital footprint, uncovering a network of fake identities, rental properties, and victim selection methods that spanned multiple states. Hartwell had been operating under at least 7 different names, each with carefully constructed backgrounds and legitimate-appearing documentation. He owned or controlled rental properties in remote areas of New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, all located in wilderness areas where disappearances could be easily attributed to accidents or voluntary disappearances. His victim selection process was sophisticated and deliberate. Hartwell monitored social media accounts, divorce websites, grief counseling forums, and job loss support groups, identifying women who were experiencing major life transitions or emotional crises. He would then create fake profiles on vacation rental sites, specifically targeting his chosen victims with listings that promised exactly what they were seeking: isolation, peace, and escape. The rental agreements Hartwell used were designed to ensure victim isolation. He required guests to surrender their cell phones upon arrival, claiming the remote locations had no service anyway. He insisted on cash payments that couldn't be traced through banking systems. Most importantly, he required guests to provide detailed itineraries of their planned activities, supposedly for safety reasons, but actually to monitor their movements and identify optimal times for his attacks. Captain Sarah Chen worked closely with FBI behavioral analysts to understand Hartwell's psychological profile. Unlike many serial killers who acted on sudden impulses, Hartwell was methodical and patient, sometimes spending months grooming a single victim before luring her to his remote properties. His crimes were premeditated to an extraordinary degree, with backup plans and contingencies that demonstrated years of experience. The investigation revealed that Hartwell had been refining his techniques since the early 2000s. His first known victim was Patricia Williams, a 29-year-old teacher from Boston who had rented his cabin in 2003 following a difficult divorce. Patricia's disappearance had been attributed to a hiking accident, and her body was never found. The pattern continued with increasing frequency as Hartwell became more confident in his methods. Each victim followed a similar trajectory. They would arrive at the cabin seeking solitude and healing, initially enjoying the peaceful environment Hartwell provided. Then he would begin his campaign of psychological warfare, subtle at first, with small signs that someone was watching them, then escalating to direct confrontations and threats that trapped them in the wilderness. The forensic team's analysis of the cabin revealed evidence of at least 4 other victims, whose remains had been disposed of in various locations around the property. Bone fragments found in a burn pit behind the cabin were matched to DNA samples provided by families of missing women. Personal items buried throughout the surrounding forest told the stories of lives cut short by Hartwell's twisted need for control. David Miller attended every court hearing, sitting in the front row as prosecutors presented evidence of his wife's final days. The details were almost unbearable. Recordings of Jessica's desperate phone calls to 911 that were never transmitted due to disabled phone lines, security camera footage showing her attempts to escape the property, and photographs of the messages she had carved into the cabin's walls during her final hours. Emma Miller, who had spent her adolescence believing her mother had chosen to abandon their family, was now confronted with evidence of Jessica's desperate fight to survive and return home. The guilt Emma had carried for years, believing she had somehow driven her mother away, was replaced by a new understanding of her mother's love and determination. If this case has already gripped you, hit that like button. It helps the channel bring more stories like this and helps Jessica Miller's story reach more people. The prosecution's case against Hartwell was overwhelming, but the elderly man's behavior during the trial was disturbing in its complete lack of remorse. He sat calmly through testimony about his victim's suffering, occasionally taking notes as if he were attending an academic lecture rather than facing justice for multiple murders. When given the opportunity to address the court, Hartwell's statement was chilling in its calculated cruelty. He expressed no regret for his actions, instead describing his victims as willing participants who had chosen to come to his remote properties. He claimed to be providing a service, helping troubled women find permanent peace in the wilderness they had sought for healing. The trial lasted 6 months, with prosecutors presenting evidence linking Hartwell to 7 confirmed murders and at least 3 additional disappearances that remained under investigation. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Thomas Hartwell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but the sentence felt inadequate to the families who had lost loved ones to his systematic cruelty. The man who had spent decades perfecting the art of making women disappear had finally been stopped, but not before destroying multiple families and leaving a trail of trauma that would affect survivors for generations. The investigation continued even after Hartwell's conviction, as authorities worked to identify additional victims and notify families who had been wondering about missing loved ones for years. The case had revealed gaps in missing person reporting systems and the ways predators could exploit vacation rental platforms to access vulnerable victims. For Jessica Miller's family, the trial's conclusion brought a form of closure they had never expected to receive. After 17 years of not knowing, they finally understood what had happened during those terrible days in the Adirondack wilderness. But the knowledge came with its own burden, the awareness of how much Jessica had suffered, while they helplessly waited for news that never came. The conviction of Thomas Hartwell marked the end of the legal proceedings, but the beginning of a different kind of journey for the Miller family. After 17 years of living with uncertainty, David and Emma now faced the challenge of processing the horrific truth about Jessica's final days and finding a way to move forward with their lives. David Miller, now 54, had spent nearly 2 decades in emotional limbo, unable to fully grieve his wife's death because he didn't know if she was actually dead. The confirmation of Jessica's murder was simultaneously devastating and relieving. Devastating because of the circumstances of her death, but relieving because the uncertainty that had dominated his life was finally over. The trial had revealed details about Jessica's character that David had always known but the world was only now discovering. The evidence showed a woman who had fought courageously against impossible odds, who had tried every possible means of escape, and who had never stopped attempting to return to her family. Far from the woman who had abandoned her family as some had whispered, Jessica had died as a hero trying to survive and come home. Emma Miller, now 25, struggled to reconcile the mother she barely remembered with the woman revealed in court testimony. The 7-year-old who had lost her mother had constructed elaborate fantasies about Jessica's disappearance over the years. As a teenager, Emma had often blamed Jessica for leaving, creating a narrative where her mother had chosen escape over family responsibility. The truth was more complex and infinitely more painful. Jessica hadn't left by choice. She had been murdered by a predator who had specifically targeted her vulnerability. The journal entries read in court revealed a woman who spoke constantly of missing her daughter, who regretted leaving even for a week, and who fought desperately to return home. Family therapy sessions helped David and Emma navigate their complex grief, but the process was complicated by years of misplaced emotions and incomplete mourning. They had to grieve not only Jessica's death, but also the lost years they had spent believing false narratives about her disappearance. The media attention surrounding the trial brought both support and additional trauma to the Miller family. While many people reached out with sympathy and understanding, others sensationalized Jessica's story or criticized her decision to travel alone to an isolated location. David found himself defending his wife's choices to strangers who felt entitled to judge decisions made by a woman they had never known. Support groups for families of murder victims provided some comfort, but Jessica's case was unusual, even within that tragic community. Most families receive closure within months or years of their loved one's death. The Millers had endured nearly 2 decades of uncertainty, creating a unique form of trauma that few could truly understand. The financial impact of Jessica's disappearance had been substantial. David had spent his retirement savings on private investigators and legal fees during the years when the case was cold. He had worked multiple jobs to support Emma while maintaining hope that Jessica would eventually return. The family's economic recovery was slow and complicated by the ongoing emotional costs of the revelation. Emma's relationship with her father began to heal as they worked together to understand their shared trauma. For years, Emma had blamed David for Jessica's disappearance, believing that marital problems had driven her mother away. The trial evidence revealed that Jessica's decision to take a retreat had been about her own internal struggles, not about dissatisfaction with her family. The Miller family decided to establish a foundation in Jessica's memory, focusing on safety education for solo travelers and supporting families of missing persons. The Jessica Miller Foundation worked to raise awareness about the dangers of unregulated vacation rentals and advocated for better safety protocols in the tourism industry. David returned to teaching with a new perspective on life and loss. His experience as a victim's family member made him a more compassionate educator, and he began speaking to high school students about personal safety and the importance of maintaining connections with family during difficult times. His history classes incorporated discussions about social justice and victim advocacy. The house where Jessica had lived remained largely unchanged since her disappearance. David had kept her belongings, her photographs and her personal spaces, exactly as she had left them. After the trial, he began the painful process of sorting through items that had waited 17 years for her return. Some belongings were donated to charity, while others were preserved as family heirlooms for Emma and any future grandchildren. Emma completed her graduate degree in social work, inspired by her family's experience with trauma and recovery. She specialized in grief counseling for families of violent crime victims, using her personal experience to help others navigate similar journeys. Her mother's story became a source of strength rather than shame. The cabin where Jessica died was demolished by court order, but the Miller family visited the site before its destruction. Standing in the place where Jessica had spent her final days was extraordinarily difficult, but it provided a form of closure that had been missing for 17 years. They held a private memorial service, finally able to say goodbye to Jessica in the place where she had died. The extended Miller family, who had provided support during the years of uncertainty, struggled with their own complex emotions about the resolution. Jessica's parents, who had died during the years she was missing, never learned what happened to their daughter. Her siblings found closure, but also carried guilt about the years they had occasionally wondered if Jessica had chosen to disappear. The investigation's resolution brought attention to other cold cases in the region, leading to renewed efforts to solve additional disappearances that might be connected to Hartwell or similar predators. The Miller family became advocates for other missing person cases, using their platform to keep cold cases in the public eye. The anniversary of Jessica's disappearance, which had been a day of agonizing uncertainty for 17 years, became a day of remembrance and advocacy. The family organized annual events to honor Jessica's memory, while raising awareness about missing persons issues and vacation rental safety. David never remarried, finding peace in honoring Jessica's memory through advocacy work and maintaining connections with other families affected by similar tragedies. His love for Jessica remained constant, but he learned to channel that love into positive action rather than endless grief. The story of Jessica Miller's disappearance and the discovery of her fate resonated far beyond the Adirondack Mountains. Her case became a cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities that predators exploit and the importance of safety precautions for solo travelers. More importantly, it became a story about the persistence of love and the eventual triumph of truth over deception. The Miller family's journey from uncertainty to closure was neither simple nor complete. 17 years of not knowing had created wounds that wouldn't heal overnight. But they had finally received the answers they had desperately sought, and with those answers came the possibility of moving forward while keeping Jessica's memory alive. The investigation into Thomas Hartwell's crimes expanded far beyond Jessica Miller's case, as federal authorities uncovered evidence of a sophisticated network of predators who had been operating similar schemes across rural America. What initially appeared to be the work of a single killer evolved into something far more disturbing: a coordinated effort to exploit vulnerable women seeking refuge in remote locations. FBI Special Agent Patricia Reeves, who had been assigned to coordinate the multi-state investigation, discovered that Hartwell had been communicating with at least 12 other individuals who owned remote rental properties in isolated wilderness areas. These communications, found on encrypted servers, revealed a community of predators who shared victim selection techniques, property management strategies, and methods for disposing of evidence. The network operated under the guise of legitimate vacation rental businesses, but their true purpose was to identify and isolate vulnerable women for exploitation and murder. Members of this network called themselves wilderness guides, claiming they were helping troubled women find peace in nature. Their communications revealed a twisted philosophy that framed murder as a form of mercy killing for women experiencing emotional distress. Each member of the network specialized in different aspects of the operation. Some focused on victim identification through social media monitoring and online forum participation. Others maintained the physical properties and handled logistics. A few individuals specialized in creating false identities and managing the complex web of documentation required to operate across state lines. The revelation that Jessica Miller had been killed as part of a larger criminal enterprise added new dimensions of horror to an already tragic case. She hadn't been the victim of a random encounter with a single disturbed individual. She had been deliberately selected, researched, and targeted by a group of people who had turned murder into a systematic business operation. Captain Sarah Chen found herself coordinating with federal agents and police departments across 6 states as the scope of the investigation became clear. Missing person cases that had been cold for years suddenly gained new significance as potential victims of the network. Families who had spent decades wondering about missing daughters, sisters, and mothers began receiving phone calls that would either provide closure or reopen wounds that had never fully healed. The network's sophistication was revealed through forensic analysis of their digital communications. They had developed detailed profiles of ideal victims, targeting women aged 25-45, who were experiencing major life transitions such as divorce, job loss, death of family members, or other traumatic events. They monitored support groups, counseling forums, and social media accounts to identify women who might be seeking isolated retreats. Property selection was equally calculated. Network members specifically sought locations that were hours away from major population centers, accessible only by private roads, and situated in areas where cell phone service was unreliable or non-existent. They preferred locations near state or national forest boundaries, where bodies could be easily disposed of in vast wilderness areas. The vacation rental platforms used by the network had minimal screening procedures for property owners, making it easy for criminals to create listings under false identities. The platform's review systems were manipulated through fake accounts that provided positive feedback for properties that were actually death traps for unsuspecting renters. David Miller struggled to process the revelation that his wife's murder had been part of a larger conspiracy. The knowledge that Jessica had been specifically selected and researched by multiple people before her death added new layers of violation to an already unbearable tragedy. She hadn't simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had been hunted. Emma Miller found herself reliving her trauma as new details emerged about the network's operations. Each revelation about their methods and victims brought fresh understanding of how calculated and deliberate her mother's murder had been. The randomness that might have provided some small comfort was replaced by the knowledge that Jessica had been marked for death long before she arrived at the cabin. The investigation revealed that the network had been operating for more than 20 years, with Hartwell being one of the founding members. They had refined their techniques through practice, learning from early mistakes, and developing increasingly sophisticated methods for identifying, isolating, and killing their victims. Federal prosecutors began building cases against network members across multiple jurisdictions, but the complexity of the crimes created significant legal challenges. Evidence was scattered across numerous locations, and many potential witnesses were themselves victims who could no longer testify. The media coverage of the network's discovery created a national conversation about the safety of vacation rentals and the vulnerability of solo travelers. Congressional hearings were scheduled to examine the regulation of short-term rental platforms and the adequacy of background checking procedures for property owners. Families of the network's victims began organizing to support each other and advocate for changes in the vacation rental industry. The Jessica Miller Foundation expanded its mission to address the systemic issues revealed by the investigation, working to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. The psychological impact of learning about the network extended beyond the immediate families of victims. Communities across rural America began questioning the safety of isolated rental properties and the trustworthiness of online platforms that had seemed to offer safe opportunities for peaceful retreats. Mental health professionals noted an increase in anxiety among women who had previously used vacation rental services, particularly those who had traveled alone to remote locations. The knowledge that predators had been systematically targeting vulnerable women created lasting trauma that extended far beyond the immediate victims. The investigation's scope continued to expand as international connections were discovered. The network had been in communication with similar groups operating in Canada and Mexico, suggesting that the problem of predatory vacation rental operators extended beyond U.S. borders. For Jessica Miller's family, the revelation of the network's existence transformed their understanding of her death from a personal tragedy to part of a larger social problem that required systematic solutions. Their advocacy work took on new urgency, as they realized that preventing similar tragedies would require changes in law enforcement coordination, platform regulation, and public awareness. The prosecution of the vacation rental murder network became one of the most complex criminal cases in federal court history, spanning multiple jurisdictions and involving hundreds of pieces of evidence collected across 6 states. U.S. Attorney Michael Harrison, who was assigned to coordinate the prosecution, faced the challenge of building coherent cases against defendants who had been operating across state lines for more than 2 decades. Thomas Hartwell's conviction for Jessica Miller's murder was just the beginning of a legal process that would eventually encompass 14 different defendants charged with various crimes ranging from murder and kidnapping to wire fraud and racketeering. The network's sophisticated structure made it difficult to prove direct connections between all members, but federal prosecutors used RICO statutes typically reserved for organized crime families. The complexity of the cases created significant challenges for the families of victims. David and Emma Miller found themselves testifying not only about Jessica's disappearance and murder, but also about the psychological impact of the prolonged uncertainty and the discovery that her death had been part of a larger conspiracy. Each trial revealed new details about the network's operations and additional victims whose cases had never been connected to the conspiracy. Sarah Patterson, a 31-year-old nurse from Vermont who had disappeared in 2015, was revealed to be one of Hartwell's victims. Her remains were found buried on property owned by another network member, ending her family's 8-year search for answers. Michael Torres, a network member who had operated rental properties in New Hampshire, was charged with the murders of 3 women between 2018 and 2022. His trial revealed that he had been using dating apps to identify potential victims, creating fake romantic relationships before luring women to his remote properties. His conviction brought closure to families who had believed their daughters had been killed by intimate partners. The trials exposed significant failures in law enforcement coordination that had allowed the network to operate undetected for so long. Missing person cases that should have been connected through pattern analysis had been handled as isolated incidents by different agencies with limited communication. The FBI announced new protocols for tracking patterns in missing person cases, particularly those involving rental properties in remote locations. Vacation rental platforms faced intense scrutiny during the legal proceedings, with evidence showing that minimal background checking had made it easy for criminals to operate using false identities. Platform representatives testified about their verification procedures, which were revealed to be largely ineffective at preventing fraudulent listings. The civil lawsuits filed by victims' families against the vacation rental platforms created additional legal complexity. Families argued that the platforms had a duty to screen property owners more thoroughly and to provide adequate safety warnings to users. The platforms claimed they were merely technology companies providing a marketplace, not travel agencies responsible for user safety. David Miller testified in multiple trials, becoming one of the most recognizable faces of the victims' families. His composed demeanor and articulate descriptions of his family's suffering made him an effective witness, but the repeated testimony took a significant psychological toll. Reliving Jessica's death multiple times for different juries prevented him from moving forward in his grief process. Emma Miller struggled with the decision of whether to attend the trials of network members other than Hartwell. While she wanted to support other victims' families, the constant exposure to details about predatory behavior and victim selection made it difficult for her to maintain her mental health. She eventually limited her attendance to cases where her testimony was specifically needed. The sentencing phases of the various trials provided opportunities for victims' families to address their loved ones' killers directly. David Miller's victim impact statement at Hartwell's sentencing became widely shared on social media, with his words resonating beyond the courtroom. "You took my wife, my daughter's mother, and 17 years of our lives. But you didn't break us. Jessica's memory lives on in every person we help and every family we support." Several network members attempted to negotiate plea deals in exchange for information about additional victims and properties. These negotiations provided closure for some families, but also revealed the scope of the network's activities was even larger than investigators had initially understood. The international connections discovered during the investigation led to cooperation with law enforcement agencies in Canada and Mexico. Several network members were extradited to face charges in other countries, while foreign nationals involved in the conspiracy were prosecuted in U.S. courts. Property seizures related to the investigation resulted in the recovery of numerous items belonging to victims, providing physical evidence of crimes and returning personal belongings to families who had lost hope of ever seeing them again. Jessica Miller's wedding ring, which had been kept as a trophy by Hartwell, was returned to David during one of the trials. The legal proceedings revealed gaps in missing person reporting systems that had contributed to the network's success. Many victims had been adult women who had voluntarily traveled to remote locations, making their disappearances appear less suspicious to law enforcement. New protocols were developed to flag cases involving rental properties and solo travelers. Mental health support for victims' families became a significant component of the prosecution process. Federal victim advocates worked with local counselors to provide ongoing support for families dealing with the trauma of learning about their loved ones' deaths and participating in lengthy legal proceedings. The network's financial operations were revealed through forensic accounting, showing that the conspiracy had generated significant profits through property rentals and the sale of victims' belongings. Asset forfeiture proceedings recovered millions of dollars that were eventually distributed to victims' families for counseling and other support services. By the conclusion of the final trial in 2027, 11 network members had been convicted of various charges, with sentences ranging from 25 years to life in prison. 3 defendants died during the legal proceedings, and 1 committed suicide while in custody awaiting trial. The convictions provided a measure of justice for the families who had lost loved ones to the network, but many acknowledged that no legal outcome could truly compensate for their losses. The years of uncertainty, the horrific circumstances of their loved ones' deaths, and the knowledge that the murders had been premeditated, business operations created wounds that would never fully heal. For David and Emma Miller, the conclusion of the legal proceedings marked the end of one chapter in their journey, but not the end of their advocacy work. They had learned that justice, while important, was limited in its ability to restore what had been taken from them. Their focus shifted from seeking punishment for Jessica's killers to preventing other families from experiencing similar tragedies. 5 years after the conviction of Thomas Hartwell and the dismantling of the vacation rental murder network, the Miller family continues to honor Jessica's memory through advocacy work that has transformed how America thinks about solo travel safety and missing person investigations. The Jessica Miller Foundation has become a leading voice in vacation rental safety reform, working with lawmakers to pass legislation requiring enhanced background checks for property owners and mandatory safety disclosures for remote rental locations. The Foundation's work has led to the implementation of new safety protocols across major rental platforms and the creation of emergency communication systems for travelers in areas with limited cell service. David Miller, now 59, has found purpose in his role as the Foundation's executive director. His quiet strength and articulate advocacy have made him a respected voice in victims' rights circles. He speaks regularly at law enforcement conferences, sharing lessons learned from Jessica's case and advocating for better coordination between agencies investigating missing person cases. The Foundation's annual conference brings together families of missing persons, law enforcement officials, and technology companies to discuss emerging threats and safety innovations. The event has become a powerful forum for policy change and family support, with attendees often describing it as a source of hope in the midst of ongoing grief. Emma Miller, now 30, completed her doctorate in social work and specializes in trauma therapy for families affected by violent crime. Her professional work is informed by her personal experience of losing her mother and living with uncertainty for 17 years. She has published research on the unique psychological challenges faced by families of missing persons and advocates for better support services during prolonged investigations. The relationship between David and Emma, which was strained for years by their different ways of processing Jessica's disappearance, has grown stronger through their shared advocacy work. They have learned to honor Jessica's memory together, while supporting each other through the ongoing challenges of grief and recovery. The cabin where Jessica died has been replaced by a small memorial garden maintained by the State Parks Service. The site includes a plaque honoring all victims of the vacation rental network and serves as a reminder of the importance of traveler safety. Families of other victims sometimes visit the location, finding peace in the quiet beauty of the mountains where their loved ones spent their final days. Technology companies have developed new safety applications specifically designed for solo travelers, many inspired by Jessica's story. These apps provide location tracking, automated check-in systems, and emergency communication capabilities that could have prevented tragedies like Jessica's death. The Miller family has worked closely with developers to ensure these tools are accessible and effective. Law enforcement agencies across the country have implemented new protocols for missing person investigations, particularly cases involving solo travelers and rental properties. The Jessica Miller Protocol requires immediate coordination between agencies when missing person cases involve remote rental locations, ensuring that patterns are identified more quickly. The media attention generated by Jessica's case and the network investigation has led to increased awareness of vacation rental safety among the general public. Travel websites now routinely include safety tips for solo travelers, and many travelers report feeling more confident about taking precautions that might have seemed paranoid before learning about the network's operations. Academic researchers have studied the network's operations to better understand how predators exploit modern technology and social media to identify and target victims. This research has informed training programs for law enforcement and mental health professionals who work with families of missing persons. The Miller family's story has been featured in numerous documentaries, books, and podcasts, but they have carefully controlled how Jessica's story is told to ensure it focuses on prevention and advocacy rather than sensationalizing her death. They have used media opportunities to educate the public about safety measures and to support other families facing similar tragedies. Support groups for families of missing persons have expanded significantly since the network's discovery, with many using materials developed by the Jessica Miller Foundation. These groups provide crucial emotional support during investigations and help families navigate the complex legal and bureaucratic processes involved in missing person cases. Emma has established a scholarship program in her mother's name, providing financial assistance for single mothers pursuing higher education. The program reflects Jessica's commitment to personal growth and her belief in the importance of education for creating opportunities and independence. David has never remarried, choosing instead to focus his energy on advocacy work and maintaining Jessica's memory through service to other families. He continues to live in the house he shared with Jessica, having finally been able to transform it from a shrine to their lost life together into a home that honors her memory while allowing for continued growth and healing. The anniversary of Jessica's disappearance is now marked by the Foundation's annual Day of Remembrance, which honors all missing persons and their families. The event combines memorial activities with educational workshops and advocacy planning sessions, transforming a day of personal grief into an opportunity for community action. The investigation into the vacation rental network revealed connections to additional unsolved cases that continue to provide closure for families years later. The Miller family maintains relationships with many of these families, offering support and guidance based on their experience with the legal system and media attention. International cooperation developed during the network investigation has led to ongoing collaborative efforts to combat similar criminal enterprises. The Miller family has worked with victim advocacy organizations in other countries, sharing resources and strategies for supporting families affected by transnational crimes. The changes implemented in vacation rental safety and missing person investigation protocols represent Jessica Miller's lasting legacy. While her death was a profound tragedy, the reforms inspired by her case have likely prevented numerous other families from experiencing similar losses. Her story has become a catalyst for positive change that extends far beyond the Adirondack Mountains, where she lost her life. David Miller often reflects on how Jessica would feel about the foundation created in her memory and the changes that have resulted from her story. He believes she would be proud that her death, while tragic and senseless, has contributed to making the world safer for other women seeking peace and healing in nature's embrace. The Miller family's journey from devastation to advocacy demonstrates the human capacity to transform grief into purpose and to find meaning in the midst of unbearable loss. While they will never fully recover from losing Jessica, they have learned to channel their love for her into work that honors her memory and protects other families from similar tragedies. Emma's young children, Jessica's grandchildren whom she never met, are growing up knowing their grandmother as a hero whose story changed how America protects its travelers. They visit the memorial garden where she died and understand that their family's mission is to prevent other children from losing their mothers the way their mother lost hers. As the Miller family continues their advocacy work, they carry with them the knowledge that Jessica's death was not in vain. if it prevents even one other family from experiencing the 17 years of uncertainty and the ultimate horror they endured. Her memory lives on not just in their hearts, but in every safety measure implemented, every missing person found more quickly, and every family spared the agony of not knowing what happened to someone they love. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Jessica Miller's story. We'll see you in the next video. In the silence of the mountains, Jessica Miller found not the peace she sought, but a darkness that would ultimately illuminate the path toward justice and protection for countless others. Her voice, silenced too soon, continues to speak through every life saved and every family spared the agony of uncertainty.